The last in-person presenter is Ignacio Campomanes, who is also a member of our Brain Trust, the third and last as they present this morning. Ignacio got his PhD from the University of Minnesota, teaches at the University of Navarra in Spain, and is a resident fellow of the Navarra Center for International Development. And he's also in the process of affiliating with the Atlantic Council and with us as a senior advisor.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. And thank you very much especially to the Freedom and Prosperity Center for allowing me to do the research on this topic that I find especially interesting. So let me briefly present what I've been doing in the last few months since I started to work with the center. And I'm going to present on the dimensions of freedom and economic performance. So as a motivation, let me just show this picture about what is the state of democracy around the world today. So here we have in blue, in dark blue and light blue, what most people would agree are democracies, different levels of them. Liberal democracies are the ones in dark blue. Those are mainly Western countries. But then in light blue, we have electoral democracies, which might have some defects in terms of how free the elections are, how well individual rights, political rights are protected, but they are considered democracies. And then in yellow and red, we have autocracies, right? And the first thing that I want you to take away from this graph is that, well, democracy is a rare event, especially liberal democracies. The way we usually think about democracies, as of today, is only 20% of the countries in the world. And even if we relax this definition of democracy to introduce also electoral democracy, it only reaches 50% of the countries of the world. And this is today. 50 years ago, it was less than 20% total. Now, the second fact that you see clearly in this picture is the great increase in the share of democracies in the world happening after the fall of the Soviet bloc, right? The so-called third wave of democratization in the 90s that seemed to vindicate Fukuyama's idea of an end of history, right? Like now all the world is going to converge to this liberal democracy idea, market economy, and everybody's going to become democratic. That seemed happening in the 90s, but what you see in the last 20 years, the share of democracy in the world has clearly stagnated at 50%. The last 20 years, some countries have democratized, but also others have experienced democracy erosion and fall into autocracy. So at the end of the day, it's just 50% of the countries of the world that are democratic. Now, the second point I want to make about the state of democracy today is what is the popular support for democracy? And here I'm just showing the answers of all respondents from 77 countries from the World Values Survey, okay, to a very specific question that asks respondents, would you say that having a strong leader that does not have to bother with parliament or elections is a very good, fairly bad, or very bad idea of governing your country? And what you see is that you would assume that most of the people would say that's a very bad idea, but that's not the case at all. 30 years ago, in the 90s, it was already 40% of the respondents to this question that were saying, yeah, it's not a bad idea to have a dictator. And what is even more worrisome is that in the last 15 years, the share of people that think that autocracy is not that bad has actually increased. It's now around 50%. And this is not just in developing countries. When you go to the data for developed countries, you also see a rise, especially after the Great Recession, in people who do not value democracy enough to think that a dictatorship is the worst thing that can happen to their country. Now, these two pieces together, the stagnation of the democratization process that started in the 90s, and the apparent decrease in the support for democracy among populations clearly shows that making the case for democracy is as pressing as ever. So this is not a battle that is won, and we still have to make the case for democracy and freedom around the world. And that's why I think that the work of the Freedom and Prosperity Center is very timely, and we should do more research on this and strengthen the case for democracy. Probably most of us would agree that democracy has value in itself. We can defend democracy in pure ethical and moral grounds as the system that better upholds the dignity and freedom of citizens, right? In the principles, based on the principles of justice, fairness, equality, etc. So we don't need to think about outcomes or consequences of democracy. We could defend democracy, and we should do it in purely ethical grounds as a better system than many others. But it is true that I don't think, especially what these answers here to this question show, is that maybe it's not the intrinsic value of democracy, what is in question today, but the consequences, to what extent democracies can also deliver in terms of prosperity, in terms of economic outcomes, right? And I think that's what explains why the share of people not valuing democracy as much clearly has started to increase after the Great Recession, especially in developed countries, right? There is this feeling that maybe democracy cannot deliver prosperity in a sustained way. There's a common mantra now said that my generation is going to be the first that is not going to live better than their parents, right? So maybe democracy is exhausted. They cannot deliver anymore. And as was mentioned before by many other speakers, China poses a seed of doubt. To what extent can we have better economic outcomes in autocratic systems? At the end of the day, we want to answer the question, is there a trade-off between freedom and economic prosperity? Because if there is a trade-off, then many people, as we see, seem to be willing to give up some freedom in order to have better economic opportunities and better economic growth. But if we can show that there is no trade-off, that democracy is not only better and superior ethically and morally, but also is a more efficient system to deliver economic growth and economic prosperity for all, then obviously we can strengthen greatly the case for democracy, right? So, if we want to know empirically, if we want to think about this relationship between political regimes and economic growth, we should ask economists, I guess. Because we have been thinking about this at least in the last 30 or 40 years. Robert Barrow started to introduce institutional variables in his growth regressions early in the 90s. Okay? So I cannot go over all the literature, the economics literature on the relationship between democracy and growth. I'm just going to ask the guy who is arguably the biggest political economist of this generation, who is Daron Acemoglu. So what does he say about this relationship? We go to a very recent paper of him and his typical co-authors, and we get the answer of Acemoglu in the very title, right? His paper is titled, Democracy Does Cause Growth, okay? This published just 3 years ago in the Journal of Political Economy. And here in this plot, you see the main result of the paper. So this is a pure empirical exercise to try to see try to compare countries that have democratized compared to those that didn't since the 1960s. So this is comparing mainly these countries that I showed at the beginning that experienced this third wave of democratization compared to those that didn't democratize, right? And the answer, the empirical answer, the quantitative answer of the paper is very clear. They show with different econometric techniques that countries that democratize attain around 20% higher GDP per capita in the medium term or medium-long term, in up to 25 years of democratization, right? And this is robust. This is a very thorough paper with different econometric techniques, state-of-the-art econometrics, a lot of robustness checks. They get the same answer, around 20% higher GDP per capita after 25 years of democratization. So does this settle the question? Can we just take these Acemoglu's work and just do the advocacy work that Dan was saying? Well, unfortunately not. Acemoglu has one answer, but if you look at the whole literature from economics and also political science, you see huge divergence of results. Okay, we are far from a consensus on the empirical relationship between democracy and economic growth. And I have here just another example of a very recent paper from authors from University College London and Paris School of Economics. And again, you see their conclusion is already in the title. They talk about a political U. So maybe the relationship between democracy and growth is not linear. Maybe it's U-shaped. That's what they get. Okay? And I like this paper because it replicates Acemoglu's empirical technique. So he uses the same econometric model as Acemoglu. And the only difference that they introduce is that instead of just dividing countries between democracies and autocracies, so a binary classification, they say, okay, we think there are 3 types of regimes, not just 2. We have pure democracies, we have pure autocracies, but there is some middle ground there, some hybrid regimes, and maybe these 3 things, these 3 kind of regimes perform differently. And that's exactly what they say. So you see it in the graph. Their conclusion is that both pure democracies and pure autocracies grow faster than these hybrid regimes. Okay? And the quantitative result is very similar to Asimoglu's one. It's around 20% after 25 years for both pure autocracies and pure democracies. Okay? So why do I see, where do I see that there is a problem of all this empirical literature and the divergence of results? Well, if you compare these 2 papers, what you see is that making a small change on the definition of democracy clearly changes completely the results. So I think economists have been focusing on econometrics, on trying to get good specifications in terms of statistics, but they have not taken a stock of all the knowledge and theoretical developments in political science and legal theory about how to define democracy and especially how to go to the attributes of democracy, right? And I think that's exactly what got me interested about what the Freedom and Prosperity Center is doing, because they're trying to go down 1 level at least, or probably more. Not just thinking about liberal democracy as a convoluted thing, but just thinking, okay, what are the attributes that make a free society? Okay? I think this is the way to make progress. Okay? We have to open the black box of democracy. Because as we've been hearing the whole morning, when we think about liberal democracy, we think about a bundle of institutions. Right? It's not just systems in which political leaders are elected by some kind of voting mechanism. It includes some other neighboring concepts, such as the rule of law, a battery of individual rights, political rights, civil rights, economic rights. We usually assume a liberal democracy has some kind of a market economy, with more or less intervention of the government, but it's a market economy with free competition, etc. So if we want to open this black box of democracy and think about the attributes or the dimensions of free societies, we have a first problem, which is a purely conceptual problem. Where do we draw the boundaries between all these things? Okay? And is it possible, actually? Can we think about the rule of law without thinking about democracy, without thinking about property rights? So this first problem has been tried to there's a first step, I think, in this conceptualization of dimensions of freedom coming from the Freedom Index that, in my view, make a lot of sense. So let me briefly, in the last minutes that I have, try to justify theoretically how these 3 dimensions of freedom that the Freedom Index includes make theoretical sense. And we can actually separate the 3 of them. So the first one, and I think the most interesting concept here, is the concept of the rule of law. Okay, because many times we think about the rule of law as equivalent to democracy. But if we go to the legal literature, most prominent legal theories have a very formal view of rule of law, right? They strip it from all substantive content. That is, rule of law has nothing to do with individual rights, has nothing to do with democracy. Rule of law, in simple terms, just means that citizens and governments abide by and are bound by the law. Whatever it says, whatever the law is saying, government and citizens follow the law. This clearly links this idea to a specific mechanism that affects economic growth, which is certainty. Right? If you know that the government is going to abide by the law, then you can look at the law and calculate the consequences and plan accordingly, especially your economic affairs. Right? Now, the second dimension of freedom that is included in the index is political freedom. There is a completely different mechanism towards growth, right? Political freedom is easier, I think, to conceptualize as some electoral core. So there are some free and fair elections that in which countries elect leaders and lawgivers. And then there are a bunch of individual rights, mainly political rights, that strengthen this electoral core, and also civil rights that give like a sphere of non-intervention from the government on individual liberty. Now, the mechanism is different. Rule of law was giving certainty. Political freedom is creating responsiveness from government policies to the preferences of the citizens, which, mediated by other different factors like inequality and many other economic factors of the environment, lead to specific policies that might be better or worse for growth. And there is a second mechanism of democracy, among many others, but there is a second one that is also important, that is an extra degree of accountability on the government and control. You know, the debate that happens in a democratic society, and we don't see in autocratic societies, not just controls the government in terms of corruption, etc., but also, with time, and this is important, it's not the first day that democracy is established, but probably with time, this democratic debate helps improve policies and get rid of policies that are not working and implement policies that are working, and especially coming from the citizens' preferences and situations. And then economic freedom is this third leg, right? And economic freedom has to do with this, you know, under the ideas of Milton Friedman and many others, this is easier to conceptualize as the absence of coercion in economic decisions. So you need societies in which you have first property rights and well-protected property rights, but you also need societies that are free to trade to gain these gains from trade. At the end of the day, you need people that have certainty about contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And the mechanism of economic freedom is different, again, from political and legal freedom. This has to do with incentives, with individuals knowing that the fruit of their labor, of their investments, of their ideas, is going to come back to themselves and reward themselves. So, very briefly, my conclusion here is that this way of thinking about democracy and dividing these three legs of freedom makes sense because it allows to have different combinations, right? You can have countries with high levels of rule of law, low political freedom, and intermediate levels of economic freedom, or the other way. Now this, I think, is what is going to make us progress in terms of analyzing this relationship of freedom and prosperity. And I think I'm going to stop here because I'm out of time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. So we'll take a 2-minute break now before we need this 2-minute break to set up for the panel. Thank you for the questions that we've received, both in the room with the QR code and online, and we will reflect the questions in our discussion with the panel. Thank you very much. 2-minute break.